Hi, I'm Hal Varian. I'm the chief economist here at Google. It's a great pleasure to introduce Erik Brynjolfsson and Andrew McAfee. I've known Erik for so long, I can spell his name. It's really quite an achievement. I don't actually haven't known Andy that long. One F or two Fs?
See, we'll get there.
But we'll get there. Someday I'll learn it. But I read their book, and now I understand all this effort that I put into spelling. It's not worth anything anymore. You know? Two S's, one F, all this stuff. I just type a couple letters, and then some automatic machine completes the spelling. So this is just the first and simplest instance of what we're all going to encounter, according to the authors. So they're going to spend the next 45 or 50 minutes telling us about what other jobs computers are going to take. Thank you.
Thank you, Hal. That's a pleasure. And according to our calculations, you will be the last person to be replaced by a robot. Well, you did make one mistake in that intro, which is we're not going to speak for 40 or 50 minutes. The reason we're here is we want to hear a bit from you about all the amazing things that you're doing and the questions that you have. So Andy and I are going to try and speak, for 15 or 20 minutes, and then do Q&A, and we'll answer whatever questions you have about the research we've been doing at MIT and the other companies we've visited and the people we've interacted with, and hopefully it'll be a very lively dialogue that way. We realize that the best way to learn about these issues is not to retreat to our offices at MIT and close the doors and windows, but to get out and interact, and hopefully it'll be something that'll be beneficial to you as well. Now, the reason we wrote this book was in part out of our own confusion about a number of trends that were going on, and they came from different groups that we've been talking to. We visited a lot of companies like Google and technology companies in the Valley. We also spent a lot of time with technologists at the Media Lab and CSAIL, the Computer Science and AI Lab at MIT and elsewhere, and heard about the wondrous things that technology could do. We had a better experience riding in the driverless car than Hal did. And we came away from that with a lot of the infectious enthusiasm and optimism that a lot of technologists have about being able to solve all sorts of problems with technology. But we also spent a lot of time with other groups, in particular economists. I was just at the American Economic Association meetings in Philadelphia, and it reminded me why the economists are often called the dismal science, because they weren't nearly as optimistic as our technology friends. They pointed out some stats that weren't so encouraging. Median income has basically stagnated since the 1990s. The employment population ratio has fallen dramatically and hasn't improved, although, as you may have heard, unemployment has gotten somewhat better. That's mainly because more people have dropped out of the labor force, not so much because people are hiring. And there's a whole set of other statistics that aren't as encouraging. And so you contrast not just the rapid innovation, but also some of the encouraging economic stats, like the fact that we have hit last month, the record wealth in the United States, 77 trillion, record GDP, record productivity, but yet these numbers on median income and employment. And it struck Andy and I as kind of a paradox, arguably the great paradox of our era. Tracing the numbers back a bit, we found that these numbers weren't always so decoupled, that through most of the 20th century, and from what we can tell, the 19th century as well, although the data aren't quite as good, these numbers all kind of rose in tandem together. Productivity, employment, median income, they were relatively tightly coupled. But then starting about 15 years ago, they became decoupled, with productivity and wealth in aggregate continuing to grow significantly, but the other numbers tailing off or stagnating or even falling some. And this accounted for these different perspectives that the technologists or the techno-optimists had when they look at one part of the story versus some of the economists who are looking at another part of the story. And we wanted to try and reconcile how that could be true. I mean, was one group right or wrong? And in fact, they were both right, but they were looking at different parts of it. And furthermore, most interestingly, we think that both aspects of this, both the record productivity and wealth and the stagnating median income, actually have a common cause. And that is the fact that technology has been racing ahead, but many people have not been keeping up with that. There's kind of a dirty secret in economics that not many people recognize because it hasn't been so important before. And that is that while technology can grow the economic pie and really is what some economists jokingly say is the only free lunch that we believe in, there is no economic law that says that everyone's going to benefit from those technological gains. It's entirely possible that some people will be made worse off. You've heard of the buggy whip manufacturers that were put out of business when Henry Ford introduced the automobile. Well, sure, there are some people who may be made worse off. It turns out that the size of that group can be almost arbitrarily large. It could be 50% or more of people who don't share in those benefits. And the data suggests that in the past 10, 15 years, that's been the pattern that's been emerging, is that technology has been making the pie bigger, but most of those benefits have been accruing to a relatively small group. Maybe 60 to 70% of them have been accruing to about 1% of the people in the past decade or so. And a lot of that, well, there are many forces at work. A lot of it has to do with the nature of technology. To give you an example, consider a simple application like tax preparation. So TurboTax can do your taxes. Many of you probably use TurboTax. I do. It's a simple piece of software that has codified that process and reduced it to a basic set of steps, digitized it. And once it's become digitized, guess what? You can make a copy of it. You can make 10 copies of it. You can make 100 million copies of it. And the marginal cost of that is very, very low. Anything that's digital can be reproduced at nearly zero cost. What's more, each copy is virtually identical to the original. And it can be transmitted almost instantaneously anywhere on the planet. As Hal writes in his book, Information Rules, which you should all read if you haven't already, these characteristics of free, perfect, and instant are not common for most other goods and services, to say the least. And they lead to sometimes some unusual economics. Some of those economics are what we call winner-take-all markets, because if someone has made a tax preparation program, you don't necessarily want to go out and buy the 100th best or the 1000th best or the 10,000th best program. You want to buy probably the best one you can find. Maybe there's some room for a small amount of differentiation if people have slightly different kinds of needs. And so a very small group, maybe one, will win the dominant share of the market. Sticking with tax preparation, that means that the people at Intuit have done very, very well. There's some billionaires there now. All of us as consumers have done well, because for $39 we can get tax preparation, and we have a lot of consumer surplus and benefits, ease of use that we wouldn't have had otherwise. But there are a bunch of people in the tax preparation business at H&R Block and elsewhere that may have had college education, may have had some skills that they've invested a long time in, and now they're not really adding a lot of value anymore. What they do isn't really all that useful to most of the rest of us. And as a result, the ranks of people who say their job is tax preparation has fallen dramatically over the past 5 or 6 years. And it's, of course, not because taxes have gotten so much easier. It's because technology can now do that job. Now, that's just one example, but it's in many ways a microcosm of what's happening in many other industries, where you can codify more and more processes and reduce them into a digital form and then replicate them. Mark Andreessen has famously said that software is eating the world. And he's got a point that this digitization is at the core of more and more industries. Not just the traditional software industries, but of course music and media, manufacturing, finance, retailing. In fact, it's hard to think of an industry that's not affected, with the possible exception of our industry, education, which I think is next in line for that kind of revolution. And that means that the same kind of, not just technology, but the same kind of economics is coming to more and more industries. A number of economists, including our colleague David Otter and others at MIT, have looked at what's happened to what they call the skill content of jobs. If you take the overall occupations in the economy and look at the underlying skills required to do them, what you find is that those jobs that involve routine information processing tasks, like for instance tax preparation, but also travel agents, bookkeepers, secretaries, those jobs have been the ones that have shrunk the most over the past decade, because automation has affected those tasks the most. Now, in doing the research for this book, Andy and I spent time visiting companies like Google And we came to the conclusion that it wasn't just that machines were getting good at routine information processing tasks, but they're getting good at a broader and broader set of tasks. I think Andy may be talking about some of those in a little while, but there's a whole wider set of applications and really, in some ways, amazing things that machines can do now, many of which I think people in this room are probably inventing and discovering. And that means that as disruptive as the past 10 years were, and it was a very disruptive decade, we think that the next decade is going to be even more disruptive, as it's going to create even more wealth, even more productivity, even more possibilities, but also it's going to change the skill content of more jobs. It's going to mean that more people will find that the existing tasks they're doing aren't adding value to the economy in the same way that they were before, because they find themselves competing with machines. And if you don't want to be competing with a $39 piece of software, if you're a human, not many people want to work for those kinds of wages. So in the end, do we come away with this analysis as optimists, or are we pessimists? Andy and I don't put ourselves in either the utopian category or the stagnationist category. We call ourselves mindful optimists because we believe that we can address the challenges and the opportunities created by these new technologies, but that there's no technological determinism that's going to automatically lead to one future or another. The book is called The Second Machine Age, but we learn a lot by looking at the first machine age, which was the Industrial Revolution. And in the Industrial Revolution, there were some new technologies, some wondrous new technologies that came along that bent the curve of human history, that took us from a relatively stagnant previous several millennia in terms of living standards, population, and many other metrics, towards an explosion of productivity and increased living standards. And those technologies primarily automated physical tasks, automated our muscles, like the steam engine, and later technologies like the internal combustion engine. The second machine age is much more about automating cognitive tasks, mental work. And we think it's going to have equally profound implications. While when you automate muscle tasks, it actually increases the demand for control systems or cognitive tasks. And in that sense, humans tend to be complements for the automated power systems. It's not so clear that automating cognitive tasks and augmenting cognitive tasks is going to be complementary versus a substitute for human labor. And as we work through the implications of the second machine age, we need to think about how we can make the kinds of adjustments we made in the first machine age so that we don't just get the increased wealth and productivity, but also the kind of shared prosperity that we had through most of the past 200 years. So with that, let me turn it over to Andy, who's going to flesh some of that out. And then we want to turn to all of you for some questions and comments and have a robust discussion about this.
Yeah, and thank you, Erik. As Erik says, the main thing we want to do is talk with you all. So I don't want to take up too much time. I want to do two things. I want to talk about where this book came from, what its origin was, and then what its goals became as we were writing it. Because if anyone tells you they know what they're trying to accomplish exactly with the book when they start writing it, they have just lied to you. So I want to talk about what our goals became as we fleshed out this book that became The Second Machine Age. I think if honestly, if there were one day that was this year where I had this eureka moment where I realized that we needed to go, first of all, get a lot smarter ourselves and then start writing and publicizing it to the world, it would be in the fall of 2010 when I'm reading the New York Times online and there is a story about the fact that this company developed a car that was driving itself on American roads in traffic with no human intervention whatsoever. And I spit out my coffee at that point for a very specific reason. This was not supposed to happen. You all were not supposed to do this. Shame on you. But more broadly, the self-driving car was supposed to remain firmly in the realm of science fiction and not over in the realm of reality. We knew this because a couple of colleagues of ours had written a fantastic book 6 years earlier in 2004 explaining to our complete satisfaction why this driving a car was going to remain over on the human side of the balance sheet and not over on the digital side. And they made a very convincing argument that that the pattern matching work that had to go on, high stakes pattern matching to drive a car, if you get it wrong, you're going to hurt somebody, the amount of information you had to take in, the different sensory channels you had to incorporate, the formal and the informal rules of the road that you had to be aware of, this was a daunting task. We humans are kind of good at it. Technology was lousy at it, and that was the way it was going to remain. And Erik and I both read the book, we taught it in our courses, we believed it, and then you all screwed up the equation by basically building a car that did this kind of stuff. And then over and over again, we saw these examples of science fiction becoming reality, and a quote from Hemingway kept echoing in my head. He has a wonderful quote about how a man goes broke. He says it's gradually and then suddenly. And we kept on seeing these examples of really incremental, really kind of boring progress turning into holy cow, we're done, eureka, this mission is accomplished. You all have, how many people have heard of the problem in robotics of SLAM? I just want to see how geeky this audience is. Oh, fantastic. I know something more than a group at Google. I'm going to go home happy today. SLAM is another thing that we humans do really easily. Everyone point to the staircase. Duh. You know, all of us could locate where we are in the room right now because we engage in what's called simultaneous localization and mapping. All of us know where the staircase is in the room. All of us know where the doors and the hallways are. We know where we are in that room. It turns out it's fiendishly difficult, astonishingly difficult to give a robot that kind of capability as well. There was a review of the literature on SLAM that was published, I believe, in 2008 that said we've made essentially no headway and we can't see what's going to change going forward. This is one of the holy grails of the robotics discipline. A colleague of ours named John Leonard back at MIT last year, or no more than a couple years ago, essentially solved SLAM for a medium-sized room. I'm not making this up, by waving a Kinect around. So he took $150 of consumer equipment and basically solved this long-standing challenge in robotics. So over and over again, we kept on seeing these really nasty, thorny problems just being blown away by smart geeks working with incredibly powerful computers and oceans of data. And that was really the motivation to write the book. First of all, for me and Erik to understand this world and then to communicate it. And then two other goals. Second thing I want to talk about is the goals that appeared as we were writing the book. Two other goals became apparent. The first was that we felt like we had to do battle with two forces out there, and Erik has talked about them. One is the force of there's nothing new here, there's nothing to see here, move on. Technology has the same role in the economy that it's always had in the economy. It's not going to lead to any bigger or different disruptions than has gone on before. I just don't believe that, and I felt it was important to try to stake out that turf and defend the claim that, honestly, this is some kind of new regime. This is a second machine age here. The second one is kind of the opposite of the nothing to see here. It's the nothing to worry about here because everything is going to be hunky-dory because of technological progress. We meet some utopians out there who say, oh, you and your silly worries about jobs and wages and workers and all that. We're creating a world that's going to be so munificent that essentially everything's going to be free. No one's going to have a job. We can all just do maker faire all the time and things are going to be fantastic. So, you know, what are you boring Northeast academic people worried about? Just come hang out at Foo Camp for long enough and you're going to walk away just totally optimistic about the state of the world. We don't buy that either. There are some real challenges coming up because of this technological progress, and to ignore them is a pretty bad idea. As Erik said, right now it's pretty clear that there's some polarization and some hollowing out going on in the middle class of America because the stereotypical median American worker does not have a college education, fewer than 40% of us do, and is not doing manual labor. They're doing low-level, fairly routine knowledge work. As most of us know, that is squarely in the sights of this wave of progress that we're seeing, but that wave doesn't stop there. Most of us would not call a doctor a median worker. Most of us would not call medical diagnosis a routine information processing task. But what Watson is doing, since it's won Jeopardy, it needs a new job, it has gone to medical school, and I'm pretty convinced that if it is not today the world's best diagnostician, it will be fairly quickly. So these disruptions in the labor force are not going to be confined to that fairly low wage, fairly average worker. They're going to go both up in the age, the wage and the skill and the education distribution, and then downward as well, because we're doing things like learning how to pick fruit automatically, which is not a prestigious job, but certainly a human one now too. And then our last goal was to try to offer some prescriptions about what to do. And I want to be pretty clear. Our prescriptions are not out there in the singularity future kind of time frame. Ray Kurzweil has the 2045 turf staked out pretty well. We don't want to go encroach on that. We don't know if we're going to get to his version of the future. One of the funniest things that ever happened to me as we were writing this book, I was on stage with a very prominent roboticist who I don't think I'll name, and he got asked a question about the singularity. And he gave a response that I thought was incredibly rude until I thought that was incredibly accurate. He said, "Look, Ray Kurzweil is going to die." All right, so we don't want to be out there in the 2045 timeframe. What Erik and I are talking about in the book and our recommendations focus on timeframes a lot closer in than that. And I can bucket them into two time phases. Things we could and should do tomorrow, the immediate stuff, and then the slightly longer term stuff. The immediate stuff is what you would learn if you picked any Econ 101 textbook off the shelf. I don't care if it was written by Greg Mankiw, who advises Republican candidates, or Paul Krugman, who's a pretty well-known liberal economist. Their Econ 101 textbook would tell a government to do a small set of things and to do them very, very well. To do education, to foster entrepreneurship in an environment, to double down and make sure you've got world-class infrastructure, and to have a fairly welcoming immigration policy, and to invest in original research. This is uncontroversial among economists. We think it's exactly the right immediate term playbook to restart economic growth and therefore restart job and wage growth as well. Looking out slightly longer term, the crazy radical ideas that we have in the book are things like, how many of us have heard of the earned income tax credit? Good. This is basically a negative income tax for people lower down on the wage and income distribution. It rewards $1 of work with more than $1 via the income tax system. Great idea. Let's subsidize labor, especially at the entry points of the workforce, as heavily as we can. Milton Friedman, that notorious socialist, advocated for a negative income tax a lot. We think that's a fantastic idea, so we believe there are more than tweaks, interventions you can do in things like the tax code that will go a long way toward putting people back to work. Farther out, again, we are not singularitarians. We're not talking about the economy of 50 years from now. For what it's worth, I think it's a science fiction economy. I think we're at the holodeck. I think we're in some crazy place because you all are going to keep doing what you do for the next 50 years. It's going to take us into a world that I can't envision. What I do know, though, is it could take us into a more utopian, kind of a cool Star Trek, explore new worlds. The phrase we use when we're not talking to geeks is a digital Athens for that world, where the citizens have these enlightened discourse all the time, and instead of being supported by human slaves, they're supported by a big army of machines that do the hard, dirty, heavy lifting in an economy. There are dystopian strains as well. And if we continue to polarize the economy, if we provide no opportunities, if mobility continues to go down, those are outcomes that I think push us in more of a dystopian direction. The broadest point I think that we make when we write the book is that the choices that we all make starting now are going to determine which of those two paths we create and we head down going forward. I think that's probably a good place to shut up. Let's turn this open and see what people want to talk about. You've had your hand up for a little while.
Yeah, I was just wondering, you were talking about negative income taxes, and one thing that comes to my mind is the patent protection system, where it essentially grants government-sanctioned monopoly to a person doing the R&D. If technology improves, would you advocate some sort of reduction in the patent window? Because that would increase competition and then share.
Yeah, this is an amazingly controversial area of work among our colleagues, IP law and IP regimes in general. The stuff that makes the most sense to me, and I want to hear what Erik says, are that we've probably gone too far with some categories of IP protection. It's not clear to me that software patents are doing more good than harm. We might want to revisit that. Companies like yours buy these companies mainly as a war chest for patents, and then you go rattle the saber against some other company, and then you have some kind of agreement. That's not value-added activity. Amazingly enough, there's a cartoon made by Disney called Steamboat Willie that is still under copyright. I think it was made in the 1920s. It's the precursor to Mickey Mouse, which Disney wants to hold on to tenaciously, I'm not sure what purpose is served by that. So I'm a huge fan of property in general, but I think our property protections might have gone a bit too far in the IP world. Does that make sense?
I think you got it exactly right, and I would just elaborate by saying that the purpose of intellectual property, according to the Constitution, and for that matter, according to economists, which in this case happen to agree, is to foster the creative arts, to foster R&D. And I think in many cases we've lost sight of that with the regime. It's been taken over by lobbyists. The copyright of Mickey Mouse is in the fact that it's been extended and re-extended. There's the Sonny Bono Copyright Extension Act that basically retroactively extended copyrights. It's hard to come up with any rationale how that would increase the incentive of people in 1920 to make more inventions by giving more wealth to the people who own those copyrights today. So that's it. And software patents is another one where when you build on previous innovations, then patents can discourage innovation rather than providing incentives because they basically take away the returns from the people who are building the new stuff and giving it back to people who have built the pre-existing stuff. So for all those reasons, there's some serious rethinking that needs to be done, or actually returning to the old thinking that needs to be done.
What do you think are the greatest risks to your predictions about rising unemployment and falling median income and hollowing out of the middle class and so forth?
Well, just to be clear, we're not necessarily predicting that. We see that as something that's happened in the past few years. And as Andy said at the end, and I tried to say at the end as well, the outcomes are going to be very much dependent on our choices. And when you say what are the risks, do you mean in terms of risks of us getting it wrong, or risks that if that happens will be the downside? There's two interpretations of the word risk. Which one do you like us to address?
What are the factors most likely to prevent those things happening?
What can we do if we don't like the trajectories? What can we do?
Well, it's partly that kind of proactive, what can we do, but it might also be, you know, trends play out in a way very different than
and we would like to see that happen. I mean, we can learn a little bit from the first machine age, because that was also a time of great disruption. It was almost exactly 200 years ago, this year actually it was, that the Luddites started smashing the looms and the machines in England because they saw them as taking away jobs. And they had a point that there were a lot of people, weavers, who were losing their jobs. But in the end, new jobs were created by the economy. And you could argue, it be a fact, that technology has always been destroying jobs and it's always been creating jobs. And over time, historically, we've created as many new jobs as we've eliminated. Now, those trends have become decoupled in the past 15 years. If you look historically, one of the reasons that we did create new jobs was because we, as individuals, as entrepreneurs, and as governments, we made a whole series of choices which helped maintain shared prosperity. Just to give you a couple of examples, it's been called America's best idea is universal mandatory education. And that helped bring a bunch of people who used to be farmers and give them a set of skills that made them suitable for a whole set of other types of jobs and occupations. And America led the world in pushing that, and not coincidentally led the world in shared prosperity and living standards. But it wasn't just some government action, it was also a bunch of entrepreneurs that helped invent and discover the new industries. 90% of Americans used to work in agriculture, now it's less than 2%. That difference didn't join the ranks of unemployed, thankfully. They were employed in totally new industries that people like Henry Ford and Steve Jobs and Bill Gates and Larry Page and Sergey Brin invented that people back then probably could never have conceived of. So it's very much the role of entrepreneurs to help identify what those new industries are. The data say that right now we aren't doing it as fast as we used to. We'd like to see more entrepreneurship to help speed up the creative destruction, especially the creative side. Surprisingly, when we looked at the data, we found that in the 2000s, there were fewer new enterprises and job creation than there were in the 90s or the 80s. So we think of this as being a very entrepreneurial era, but actually the data suggests that in some ways it's not. If we could speed that up, if we could in some sense crowdsource this question of where will the jobs come from, which is historically how we've solved the problem, we think we'd be hopeful that we could improve on that situation. But we have to say that you know, in fairness, we are not completely sure that the future is going to play out just the way the past did. It's been said, I heard this from Hal Varian, that history doesn't repeat itself, but sometimes it rhymes. I'm not sure where you got that from, but
Hal Varian looks a lot like Mark Twain. I think.
yeah, I think maybe that's where he got it from. So maybe we will be able to replicate some of the successes, but I'm sure it's going to require some different. We can't just double down on doing the exact same thing we did before. We're going to have some different kinds of policies, and that's why we wanted to start this conversation, was to help identify what those new changes are going to need to be.
I like your question a lot. I think the main thing that could make might make the future play out differently than I'm envisioning right now is if Erik and I made the classic geek mistake when we were writing the book of becoming too enamored of the technologies we were looking at and projecting them too far into the future and thinking that their impact is actually going to be bigger than they are. I don't think we've made that mistake, but if we have, then economic growth will have some really different consequences, and the employment impact of technology will be less than I'm currently thinking it is. That'd be kind of a good mistake to make.
So a little more than a year ago, Paul Krugman wrote an op-ed in which he observed that a lot of the new technologies are going to start putting more wealth in the hands of people that have capital to start with, people that can afford the robot army that then takes all the manufacturing jobs.
Right.
So I'm wondering what kind of economic restructuring you need to go through to be able to deal with that new paradigm. I know what's happened before, like you've mentioned in the first machine age, but it seems like it's going to be on a lot larger scale this time.
So the great phrase that Krugman used was robots and robber barons, right, are going to get all the benefits of the world that we're creating. And he thinks that's a pretty bad outcome. We do too. What can we do to make sure that doesn't happen? Again, we're going to sound a little bit like broken records. What we don't want to do, what we're really careful, what we're sure we don't want to do is storm the barricades of capitalism and fundamentally rethink the economic contract right now in 2014. Most of it's working pretty well. The biggest problem that you identify and that we spend time on is it might get harder and harder to make a living from your labor as opposed to from your capital. If that's really what's going on, let's remove the barriers, let's try to upskill our labor, let's remove any tax or whatever distortions to doing that, and let's see how that goes before we start thinking about getting rid of capitalism or demonizing capitalists or things like that.
So if you assume that there's something called structural unemployment, which, for my purpose of my question, means someone whose potential benefits of being employed are less than the costs of employing them. I guess my question is, do you think that exists? Do you think there's a population that fits that category? How large do you think it is today, and what do you think is going to happen to that number over the next coming decades?
Sorry.
Sure. There are a number of ways that you can get. The answer is yes. I can see that there is some structural unemployment, and there are a number of ways you can get to that, and some of them are very discouraging. If you look to in the 1930s, when much of agriculture, when tractors were introduced, mechanizing a lot of agriculture, Joe Stiglitz and others have pointed out that took tens of millions of people who used to work on farms and threw them into the labor force, and it caused a macroeconomic, or helped contribute to a macroeconomic recession, or the Great Depression, and it took a decade or more for many of them to be reskilled and for new industries to crop up to hire them. And you can easily see that that kind of mechanism could happen today, not with farmers, because there aren't any of them left hardly, there's only 2% of the population and falling, but in, say, routine information processing tasks. And one of the things that concerns me is that by the time you find new skills and new jobs for those people to do, what if the technology has changed again? Yeah. What if you have another disruption, and then you're in this constant pattern of trying to catch up with what's going on before? And if the pace of technology speeds up, then you could see that not only would you have structural unemployment, but it could get more and more severe over time. One of the ways this manifests itself is not just through unemployment, but also through inequality. If you're a true free market economist, you say, well, markets will always clear. I mean, you just have to let them clear. And at some level, that's what the math says, that's true. But the wage at which they clear, the price at which they clear, could be arbitrarily low. It could be $5 an hour, it could be 5 cents an hour, it could be 0.05 of a cent an hour. And I think most of us would agree that at least 2 of those numbers, and probably all 3 of them, aren't ones we feel very comfortable as seeing as the clearing wage for labor.
It could be negative.
Well, if you figure the cost of hiring somebody, like right now, you know, if you look at somebody gave me a horse and said, here, you can have a horse and you can use it to ride to work and whatever else you want to do with it. I say, thanks, but no thanks. I really, even if I got it for free, it wouldn't be worth it. And so you're certainly right that an input of production, once you cover the other costs associated with it, even 0 might be too high a price.
The question that Erik and I have wrestled with the hardest as we wrote this book, we've had not just like bantering, but honest arguments and disagreements about it, is are we heading into an area where the average worker is a horse? In other words, if I couldn't walk up to a factory or a warehouse or an office park with a horse and say, hey, you can have this horse for 1/10 of a penny a day, put it to work. They'd say, get lost. I have no use for that input in my system of production anymore. We're not headed there tomorrow, next year, next 5 years, even with this ridiculous technological progress. Question I honestly don't know the answer to is, are some of us heading into horse territory in the economy that we're creating? Most of the really smart economists that we talk to find that a fairly ridiculous proposition. I was talking earlier this week with a guy who's got a Nobel Prize, and I said, does your intuition tell you that if we play our cards right, and that's not a given, obviously, with the polarization in Washington and everything, if we play our cards right, though, that we can be back to a full employment economy after this nasty transition, maybe lasting 20 years? And he said very confidently, oh yeah, absolutely, we can get back to a full employment economy. I just find myself less confident than that. And again, I want to stress, it's your fault.
There's no doubt that technology is contributing to the hollowing out of the middle class, but there's another effect which is technologically related, and I'm not sure if you're talking about it directly or indirectly, but it's the fact that communication barriers have come down, and so now a lot of knowledge work that could be done, used to be done in America, can now be done elsewhere, right, which is good for other countries, but just not so great for this one. So how do those two variables interact, and what will the trend be?
So, well, you're right. I think that there are 2 big trends that are affecting the economy today: globalization and technology. And then there's some other smaller trends in terms of cultural changes, unionization. But just focusing on those 2 big ones, I agree entirely that globalization is in large part enabled by some advances in technology, especially communications technologies, also some transportation technologies. But of the 2, we think that the technology one is the one with more legs and the one that's accelerating. And if you look at a lot of kinds of jobs that have been offshored historically, now many of them are coming back to the United States. Which low-wage country do you think Apple on the 30th anniversary is making their Mac Pro computers? USA. They're making in Austin, Texas, not because the wages are so low in Texas. Maybe we should say not just because they're so low in Texas, but not because of the wages there, but because there's hardly any labor required anymore. They're bringing them back here, and that's happening for a lot of knowledge work as well. Larry Summers pointed to us once when we were talking about this, that if you look at manufacturing employment in China, how has that changed in the past 15, 20 years as all those manufacturing has grown in China? It's actually fallen. There are 20 million fewer people working in manufacturing now than there were 20 years ago. So manufacturing employment is leaving both the United States and China, not going to Vietnam, but going to robots. And so we're seeing in many ways, our view is that if anything, offshoring is just a way station on the road to automation, and some of these low-wage countries are even more in the bullseye of automation and the second machine age than American or Western European or Japanese workers, because the more routine the tasks are that you're doing, the easier it is for someone to write a piece of software or a robot or a program to do that. And if your competitive advantage is, hey, we'll do it for cheaper, well, I don't think that's a very strong barrier to entry compared to what's happening with the pace of technological change.
And you asked specifically about knowledge work. I came across this really interesting series of stories in the press a while back because some different reporters noticed that when they were calling up their insurance company or their credit card company or their bank, they seemed to be interacting with this perfectly accented American voice that was giving them somewhat canned responses, or the same sentences or sentence fragments over and over again. And so they pushed on that, and they noticed that they think there are two different strains going on right now. One is where there's a Filipino listening to what they're saying, because English skills are pretty good there, and then pressing a button for which American accented response they're supposed to spit back on the fly. The slightly more advanced version of that is there's an algorithm listening to what the person is saying, and the algorithm hits the button for which pre-recorded human voice should be given back to the person. Step 3 of that progression, I believe, is, we have all seen the movie Her, is Scarlett Johansson's synthetic voice is just going to give us a response back.
That's the future we're all hoping for.
Yeah, exactly. You know, can't get here soon enough. But it's not science fiction stretch anymore to imagine a completely synthetic interaction like that. Again, for knowledge work, we think that offshoring is a way station on the way to automation.
How much do you think this is a US issue versus a global issue?
Well, it's certainly a global issue. I mean, if you look at a lot of the trends we gave were using US numbers, frankly, because we are the most familiar with them and some of the best data is available here. But if you look at the OECD, the Organization of Economic Cooperation and Development, the most developed countries, you see a very similar pattern. For instance, the hollowing out of routine jobs has happened in virtually every one of those industries, according to research by my colleague David Otter and others. The inequality has grown in all those countries. It has grown in Sweden, Germany, France, Japan. There's only 2 or 3 countries where it hasn't grown, Greece and I think one other one, and there's just some weird things going on in those countries that probably aren't typical. And as we just said, when you look at the developing nations, you see, I think arguably, that they may be even more in the bullseye. And I think this could be a real concern because historically, having low wages and taking some of those kinds of jobs in textiles and other areas has been a path to development, to get out of that underdeveloped state. You, for a while, do those really low-wage jobs, and then as you work your way up the ladder, you start joining the broader economy. If that path is cut off, it could be very troubling. Those countries that haven't made the transition may be stuck for a long time on the other side of the ledger.
There was a nice piece of work done by a couple University of Chicago economists just recently that looked at the returns to capital versus labor in many countries around the world. And they found the pattern was really similar, almost without exception. The share of total GDP that was getting paid out in labor was heading south country after country after country around the world. We can't think of an explanation for that that doesn't involve technology. Right. And in fact, they said the explanation is explicitly information technology.
Right, and I think that that's a very important point to emphasize, is because there are people who say, well, it's because of what the Congress did or what the guys in Wall Street did or whatever. And I'm sure there have been a lot of bad things done in Washington and Wall Street and elsewhere. But the fact that this pattern is so pervasive and so global suggests to us, or is additional evidence to us, that there's some more fundamental economic forces and technological forces at work.
I think once you have big problems like health and legal system politics become sort of automated, like having your differential diagnosis done by a machine or a phone app and tells you exactly what's happening, you probably have more trust of a better diagnosis than the best doctor out there. And for this layer of very high-paid cognitive type of skills, there is a lot of infrastructure built to protect this system, and a lot of politics and lobbyists that want to make sure that it stays. And can we create a baseline for, let's say, before we go that route, there needs to be a unanimous approval on what can go, not to serve a particular interest of a certain group, but rather humanity at large? So,
no is the short answer to that
After that
question.
polite way
it's a lovely question. I'm going to give you a dismissive answer. No, we certainly can't change our political structure that deeply, so we have to have a plebiscite before every instance of technological change and lobbying. We're not going to get there. But you bring up a really important point, which is that I won't speak for Erik. I think that the main impediment to a lot of the stuff, the great stuff that we're going to see, is exactly the barriers that you identify, are regulatory barriers that are there to protect incumbents as opposed to protecting consumers. They primarily have that effect. Our lobbying groups, or all the forces of inertia that are trying to keep stuff from happening. When you look at some of Uber's recent troubles are self-inflicted. Let's be really clear about that. Some of the other ones have been brought on by exactly the forces you identified. Did you all hear that France is making Uber wait 15 minutes before a minimum of 15 minutes before the car can show up, purely to protect their taxi? This is insane, but we're going to see all kinds of stuff like that go on. Stupid question time. How many of us have heard of Tim O'Reilly? Dumb, right? Tim has a beautiful way to phrase it, and it's something that I carry around. He says, look, with our policy and our regulatory decisions, we have two choices. We can protect the past from the future, or we can protect the future from the past. For heaven's sake, let's protect the future from the past.
Right, and that's not to say that there aren't policies that we should adopt, but I 100% agree with Andy that there's a natural reaction to either smash the machines, the Luddite approach, or to freeze the existing occupations and jobs the way they are through a whole set of occupational licensing and other incumbent protection acts. And while those seem like natural ways to prevent some of the bad outcomes, ultimately we think they're going to be more destructive than beneficial. The way that the economy has thrived in the past has been what Joseph Schumpeter called creative destruction. And the answer is not to try to slow down the new ideas and the new technologies, it's to speed up our adaptation. And the government can help in many ways by, for instance, I mentioned earlier, universal public education was one idea, and raising the skill levels, encouraging, boosting and speeding entrepreneurship, not slowing it down, doing things with tax policy, doing things with R&D. So there are lots of things you can do to help with the preconditions to smooth and speed the transition, but freezing in the historical structure is probably going to be, we're certainly going to do more harm than good.
So companies like Apple make money by building fancy gadgets to sell to consumers, and companies like Google make money by allowing advertisers to advertise their fancy gadgets to consumers. And all of this requires that the consumers are there and they have jobs and they have money. So, you know, in a sense, we have an interest in making sure that this situation you talked about where workers turn into horses doesn't actually happen. Are there any sort of economic models which talk about this and say that there might be some kind of tipping point where it all gets into a horrible negative feedback loop? And
we can summarize the situation you're describing in an apocryphal story about Henry Ford II and Walter Reuther, who was the head of the Auto Workers Union. There's a story about the two of them going through a very highly automated brand new plant that Ford had built, and they were kind of joshing with each other. I'm sure they hated each other deeply, but they were kind of joshing with each other. And Henry Ford points to one of his new pieces of equipment. He says, "Hey, Walter, how are you going to get those robots to pay union dues?" And Reuther says, "Hey, Henry, how are you going to get them to buy cars?" So this is exactly the problem that you're identifying. If people are out of work, if their wages are going down, aggregate demand in the economy goes down, we know that's a really bad thing to have happen. And what I don't know is how soon is this coming, how bad will it be, but any reluctance to spend is going to cause the economy and overall demand to head in the wrong direction. And that reluctance to spend can be based in reality, or it can be based on Keynes's famous animal spirits.
Right, and the example I gave earlier about what happened in the Great Depression, Joe Stiglitz described that as being one of the contributing factors to that fall in demand, and so it's potentially going to have macroeconomic effects as well as these distributional effects.
I wanted to ask you something personal and specific.
And I see we're just about out of time.
So last week there was a lengthy article in The Economist about the future of jobs, and it liberally quoted from you.
Not liberally enough, I'll tell you that.
in your books, and your upcoming book. And so I wanted to ask you, if you are a parent or want to be a parent, what would you advise your children to do who are going to enter the workforce in the next 2 decades? What careers and what kind of education opportunities should they pursue? Because the classic types of things that maybe we have told them in the past, go become a lawyer, go become an accountant, go become a doctor. You know, this is a ticket to professionalism, upper middle class lifestyle, and the odds of you becoming unemployed are very low. And I don't feel that that is going to be the case going forward anymore. And so I want to kind of put that on you, and if you had to advise your own son or daughter, what would you say?
Let's have the parent answer first.
It's a good question, and it's a tough one, but there are still some categories that machines are not very good at, and we hesitate to we almost never say never because of what we've seen in terms of advances, but things involve significant amounts of creativity, invention, entrepreneurship. Those have not been affected at all. In fact, they've been augmented. They've become more valuable. Interpersonal interactions and skills. Machines so far are still not very good, although we've got friends in the Media Lab and elsewhere that are pushing the frontiers on that. But whether that's motivating people or even just caring for a sick child, comforting somebody, that's something that machines don't seem to be very good at. I would encourage my kids to be flexible, because whatever types of tasks that are or aren't automated now, it's likely to change, and people are going to have to change and adapt much more quickly than in the past. So we don't know for sure exactly which categories are going to be affected. Those are some of them, but maintaining that flexibility is probably going to be one of the key things you can do.
You asked a personal question. I'll give a little bit of a personal answer. I'm not a parent, but the most common question that we get asked about this stuff comes from parents of kids of all ages saying, what advice do I give? What do I do? So my advice for parents of young kids is actually a lot easier for me. I say just send them to Montessori. And not that that's a panacea. Are there Montessori kids in the room? Really? That's amazing. If one or both of your founders were in the room, hands would be going up. There's a Montessori mafia among the technology elite, and I was a Montessori kid too. And what it taught me is that the world is a really interesting place, and your job is to go poke at it. I think that's great. My school only went up through the 3rd grade, so in the 4th grade, I went into the public school system in the Indiana town where I'm from, and I felt like I had been sent to the gulag. I'm like, you want me to sit here all day and a series of things is going to be inflicted on me at like 45-minute intervals? What are you people, sadists? It made no sense to me whatsoever. So early on, go teach your kids that the world is an interesting place. At the college level, my silly bumper sticker advice is put down the beer pong paddle and just go do a double major. Go hang out with the theater geeks at one side of campus and the math geeks at the other side of campus. Fill up your toolkit as much as you can.
And the only other thing I would add to that is that if we do tend to more of a winner-take-all market, there's even more of a premium than there was in the past on being the very best in something. So it becomes important to pursue things that you're really passionate about, that you're interested in, because we all know that you're not likely to be the best at anything that you're just doing because you have to or because you're supposed to. But there are going to be niches, large niches and small niches and tiny ones where somebody has the potential to be among the best in the world, and those are the ones that are still going to be in demand. Whereas if you're just another person doing a job sort of because you have to, it's going to be increasingly hard for people to find a way to make a living doing that.
We seem to take it for granted that investing in education is a wise thing to do, at least on a macroeconomic scale, but on a personal scale, given the rising polarity and prosperity, if I'm not rich and my prospects of becoming well off are very, very slim, why should I personally invest in, why should I be motivated to invest in educating myself if the chances of that having me better off are so low?
Well, the data suggests that even today, the difference in earnings between people with more education and less education is enormous, and it's been growing. So from a purely selfish personal point of view, it does pay to get more education. But it's important to understand that when we talk about education, first off, we don't just mean college or postgraduate education. We mean all levels, whether it's K through 12, vocational, lifelong learning, all of them, building more human capital in any of those dimensions is likely to add value. But we also think that education has to be reinvented exactly along the lines that Andy was describing earlier. The traditional pattern of having people sit in rows and learn to follow instructions carefully from the person at the front of the room, well, following instructions is something that machines are really pretty good at doing. So education of that model and imparting facts and numbers isn't likely to be the kind of thing that we need more of in the future. Education that sparks creativity, that allows you to think about new ways of putting things together and create things, that's much more likely to be something that adds value.
Here.
Thanks for a wonderful talk. So kind of coming back to this policy question, how aware would you say the average policymaker or politician in the U.S. is about these trends, and how could we actually get more of our politicians to understand the nuance of what you're talking about? Someone
needs to write a book about it. You can either be really pessimistic or somewhat optimistic about it. I'd say the awareness is early days, but growing kind of quickly. And everyone that we talk to, there's really well-informed people, bemoan the polarization in Washington and this environment we have where if you say black, by definition, I'm going to say white. But the green shoots that we see are around some pretty important areas like immigration policy. There is a pretty broad bipartisan agreement that we need to change some things. There's a lot of talk about how we need to reinvent education. No one's exactly sure what, how we need to do that. So I would say the awareness is, especially about this tech stuff, because Washington's not a technophilic place, the awareness is low, it's getting better kind of quickly, and maybe it'll get okay at some point.
Yeah, I mean, that's certainly one of the more depressing parts of our analysis is just the way things are so stagnant in Washington and in public policy in general. There is a growing amount of anger, whether it's the Tea Party or Occupy Wall Street or other groups, but our sense is that by and large they mostly have misdiagnosed the nature of the problem. Yeah. And if you don't have the right diagnosis, you're probably not going to have the right prescriptions. And so a big part of the reason we wrote this book was to help change the conversation. Ultimately, we've been told by people who know better, Washington doesn't lead the country. It's people who leads it, and they will respond to what people are demanding. So phase one is spreading the awareness, as I think you just brought up, getting people to understand some of the issues that are important. And once that conversation has been changed, we're going to have much better hope of changing the kinds of policies.
So you talked quite a bit about what regulators can do to counteract some of these effects. Is there anything we can do, given that at Google we are pushing technology forward and are often techno-optimists?
Yes, stop, okay?
No,
don't. That's the first thing. This is actually really important. We come across a lot of really well-meaning people who kind of want you guys to stop what you're doing and want the tech sector to slow down and stop putting people out of work. We think that's the single worst idea that we come across. So, by all means, carry on taking us into the future. It's incredibly important work. As individuals, advocate, support enlightened policies, vote for and support people who are taking our policies in the right direction, and just participate in the democracy. Our friend Larry Lessig talks about how we feel so disengaged from the process and we become increasingly cynical about it. Just don't do that, please.
Technology, go ahead.
I think I meant sort of in between.
Yeah.
So,
let me try and go with that, because I think that the technologists and engineers have been great at solving problems. And we talked to some of the folks that responded to the first DARPA Grand Challenge, which was, as you know, probably, to build a driverless car, which many people thought was impossible, and they responded. The new DARPA Urban Challenge is a robot, 6-foot Atlas robot that weighs about 300 pounds that actually will be able to walk up to a vehicle, open the door, get inside, drive it, get out, walk across rubble, up some stairs, attach a hose, a whole set of other tasks. And again, at first it seemed like science fiction impossibility, but our friends at the MIT Computer Science and AI Lab and elsewhere seem to be making headway on that. It may be that we need to think about a new kind of grand challenge that isn't to make an amazing new technology, but it's just to think about how we can reinvent an economic, social, organizational system, one that creates as many jobs as it's automating. Many of the previous engineering tasks have either implicitly or quite explicitly been designed to answer the question, how can we take labor out of this process? How can we make this more labor saving and have a machine do what a person used to be able to do? But technology doesn't have to just be a substitute for humans. Many technologies can be complements for humans and can enhance the value of humans. And maybe if we put more focused effort into a grand challenge for creating technologies that boost the amounts of labor, that are complements to labor, and allow people to do things they couldn't have done before, then we are likely to get that kind of shared prosperity world that we were hoping for. And so that would be the kind of grand challenge. We haven't quite figured out how to formulate that right, but maybe if we could do that, it would inspire many of you and people elsewhere in the country and the world to try to solve that problem, as opposed to waiting for, say, Washington to take action.
I think we have time for one more question, but it has to be a really bang-up final question. Are you ready?
Sure, maybe. So actually, that was a really interesting answer that you, if underspecified so far, that you started to give, because before you started to give that, I would start to wonder if you had the reaction, other people had the reaction to the book that your proposed prescriptions don't seem of the same magnitude as the description, as the problem that you're describing.
Yes.
For the most part, you seem to just be describing tweaks, or maybe if you have one big idea, it's education, which everybody has talked about for years and nobody knows how to fix. And if you could fix it, it wouldn't pay off for decades down the line anyway, and you'd have new problems by that point. So, like, what do you think is the biggest policy prescription or advice for the future that you have that is proportionate to the magnitude of the problem?
And the nastiest and maybe most accurate comment we've gotten about our work is, you guys are proposing linear solutions to an exponential situation. Ow, right? So we're mindful of it. What we don't want to do is say that we know what the trajectory of technology is going to be, and therefore what kind of moonshotty intervention is appropriate to get there. What we're saying instead is essentially, let's iterate, let's tinker, let's mess with the things that we know will move the dial in the right direction, and let's make sure that we're tracking the problem correctly, as opposed to trying to anticipate where this thing is going to be in some crazy time frame down the road. I take a lot of insight from your chairman's repeated assertion that the crazy long frame planning horizon for Google is 5 years. Overshooting that by a lot with our policy recommendations seems like a recipe for failure or disaster.
I mean, you raise a very important point, which is that we don't have a silver bullet solution to this. I wish we did, but we can't point to one silver bullet solution. And that partly reflects how we went about writing this book. Many people who write this kind of book start with a policy, and then they go and write a bunch of reasons why this policy needs to be put in place.
Because they're policy guys.
Right. We are not policy guys, and we focused on diagnosing what's going on. We want to lay those issues out. We have 3 chapters worth of potential solutions that we think will help with the problem. But ultimately, we think that by starting this conversation, maybe you and others in this room and elsewhere will help develop the solutions. We lay out some of the problems there. And this is the kind of thing that, just as in the past, we hope to crowdsource it in essence. And we have tried to walk the walk a little bit in terms of starting a new initiative on the digital economy at MIT, where we were bringing together people to grapple with these questions. And we're hoping we can make some progress. But I have to confess, I can't say here, and if you just implemented the earned income tax credit, the problem would be solved, because it's not going to be that easy.
A very brief follow-up. When you're in a ditch, stop digging. What's the single most thing that we shouldn't do to make the problem worse that maybe we are already doing?
Turning out people who do not have the skills to be valuable workers in the economy of today, let alone tomorrow. The business leaders that we talk to are so frustrated up and down the skill ladder, they can't find the people that they need, even for the positions they have open, even here in America. That just doesn't make any sense.
I would second that. I would also say that there's been a problem of siloing technical people from the economists and the policymakers. We find that these groups that we try to bridge just don't speak the same language. They don't even recognize the same problems. And if we could get people coordinating on those, I think that would be half the battle.
Thank you all for coming. This is fantastic.